Welcome back to Sissy Maya. Make sure to subscribe to our channel to never miss an update. Additionally, consider subscribing to my Patreon to get access to these features, and much more. She followed the other passengers onto the plane, where the ticket agent tore her ticket and handed back the stub. She found her seat, a little ahead of the wing, her favorite spot because she loved watching the ground fall away as the plane took off. The feeling of the massive aircraft rising into the sky, carried only by the air beneath it, always exhilarated her. Finally, the plane taxied down the runway and ascended slowly to cruising altitude. The flight attendants began to move about, offering snacks, drinks, and distractions. Emily looked across the aisle and noticed a man covering his eyes during takeoff. He slowly removed his hands but was still trembling. Emily found herself trembling slightly too, though from excitement. In the rush of preparing for the trip, bidding farewell to new friends, and getting to the airport, she hadn't had time to process everything. Now, as the plane climbed into the sky, she realized something significant had happened. Her life had turned a corner, and she could never view herself, other transgenders, or her ministry the same way again. They called it First Event, held in Boston, and the name felt oddly fitting for Emily. It was her first gender conference. Throughout her transition, she had never attended one. She'd made excuses, no time, the workshops didn't seem relevant, they were too far away, but beneath it all, there was shame. Shame about being associated with them, the crossdressers, the drag queens, the transvestites, even other transgenders. Emily didn't dislike gender-variant people, after all, she was one of them. But for 5 years, she had tried to put all of that behind her. But God had other plans. This weekend, Emily realized what he was about to do and, with a reluctant acceptance, decided to go along for the ride. That decision would change her life forever. Reflecting on her journey, Emily realized that this kind of life-changing decision had happened 3 times before. 3 times she had faced her own personal Rubicon, trembling as she crossed, knowing that life could never go back to what it was. The first time was back in 1979, or was it 1980? The exact date didn't matter much. It had been nearly 20 years. Strange how it seemed both recent and distant at the same time. Back then, Emily lived in Eugene, Oregon, right across from the University of Oregon. She worked at a radio station, and her name was Carl. Carl was still clinging to life support, but that wouldn't last. In a final attempt to salvage her faltering masculinity, Carl asked Maggie, a woman from church, out to dinner. They had mutual interests, music, literature, Bible study. This was Carl's 6th date in 10 years, and the last. The evening was polite, predictable, with Carl asking the inevitable second date question. Maggie politely declined, saying she valued Carl's friendship but nothing more. Carl felt a sense of relief mixed with sadness. At home, Carl could no longer deny Emily, and after a half-hour of crying, Emily accepted her truth. Okay, I'm transgender, she thought. There's nothing I can do to change that. So, what do I do now? It was 10 more years before Carl officially became Emily, but the acceptance of Emily began that day. The flight attendant brought Emily a drink and a small bag of nuts. She counted the 12 nuts on a napkin, wondering why everything on an airplane seemed smaller. The Coke was full-sized, at least. Across the aisle, a man was trembling and drinking rapidly. Emily glanced out the window as the plane soared into the sky. It was dark, but she could see the scattered lights of small towns far below. Her thoughts drifted to the second time she crossed her Rubicon. It had been nearly 10 years later, in January 1991, or maybe December 1990. She was 37, living in Fresno after a few years of odd jobs and working in media. After a stint in Eugene, she had landed her first serious teaching position and was entering her 2nd semester. She had been living with her parents and wavering in her understanding of where her transgender identity would take her. During the last 7 or 8 years, Emily had done limited cross-living in Eugene, where she attended a Christian women's club and a Bible study without revealing her identity. No one knew, and if they did, they kept it quiet. Now, Back home in Eureka, Emily had resumed cross-dressing. She would wear feminine clothes, then throw a suit and tie over them to maintain her male persona. She'd find a deserted parking lot, tear off the male facade, and assume her female identity. It was a dangerous, paranoid existence, but it was easier than fully denying her true self. With a good job and some financial stability, Emily began seriously considering transitioning socially and physically. She tested the waters by living as male one day and female the next, even attending 2 different churches on alternating Sundays. This continued for a couple of weeks. Then, one day, she found herself standing in front of her closet, unable to decide between the 2 halves of her life. In desperation, she threw her hands up and cried out, "God, I give up. I mean it, God, I give up. I can't figure out what I'm supposed to do. You say your peace will rule my life, but I have no peace. So, it's in your hands now. I'm done living half and half. If you want me to be a man, you'll have to make me one. If not, you'll have to affirm my feminine identity. From now on, I'm going to live in accordance with the identity you've given me. My transgenderism isn't my problem anymore, it's yours." Emily had never anticipated the direction her journey would take. As she looked back at her life, she realized that the transition had brought her to a place of deeper emotional connection, one where she could feel her emotions fully, without cutting herself off. It was strange, yet liberating, to be able to cry. For so many years, even tears had been denied her. "Oh, Lord," she cried, "why me? Why now? Help me find peace." But deep down, Emily knew she had already been given peace. It was a peace hidden in the secret corners of her heart, and it was only through faith that she could access it. As she reflected on the past year, the challenges she had faced, she understood that she could overcome this storm as well. Her foundation was solid, even if the wind shook the shutters. She got up to grab a drink of water and realized that she'd been lying in silence for nearly half an hour. Walking toward the water cooler, she remembered the words of a song. God on the mountain is still God in the valley. He'll take what's wrong, and he'll make it right. The God of the good times is still God in the hard times. The God of the day is still God in the night. As she took a sip of water, she whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for being the God of my night." With the glass rinsed and the lights off, Emily went to bed, preparing for the big day ahead. January 10th, 49 BC. Julius Caesar stood on the banks of a small stream marking the southern boundary of Cisalpine Gaul, facing a pivotal decision. He could turn back to safety or cross the Rubicon, risking capture, torture, and execution. But if he succeeded, he could save the crumbling Roman Republic and establish an empire that would last for centuries. With finality, he crossed the river and declared, "Iacta ist alia, the die is cast." As Emily rushed through Boston International Airport, frantically searching for Gate 43B, she wasn't thinking about Roman history. Yet, in her own way, over the past few days, she too had crossed her personal Rubicon. The die was cast, and she had made her choice. The plane hadn't left yet, just creeping up to the boarding tunnel. Emily had a few minutes to wait while the passengers disembarked. Then, first-class passengers would board, followed by the 100,000-mile club members, and finally, the rest of the passengers. It would be a while, so she might as well sit down and wait. Airports, Emily mused, are in-between places. They're temporary communities, places where people pass through without ever truly belonging. You must leave the airport to enter the community. But while you're there, you exist in a transient world. Passengers of all types, workers moving from one task to the next, families preparing to reunite, and strangers crossing paths for only a brief moment. Each of them, in their own way, waiting for something to change. Sitting in a plastic chair, Emily felt this same sense of in-betweenness. Transition, she thought, felt like an airport, a place of waiting, departure, and anticipation. She wasn't sure what her next steps would be, but the journey she was on had already led her to a profound shift. Boarding for Flight 187 to Los Angeles now commencing at Gate 43B, the airport announcement echoed. Emily gathered her purse and carry-on, feeling a sense of both security and uncertainty. Her bags were secure for now, but the journey ahead was uncharted. She followed the other passengers onto the plane, her ticket was torn, and she found her seat. As the plane ascended into the sky, Emily looked out the window. The ground fell away, and she marveled at the view, at how far she had come, and how much farther she had yet to go. The weight of the decision, the Rubicon she had crossed, settled into her chest. But, as the plane climbed higher, so did her sense of purpose. Emily had convinced herself that she was no longer truly transgender, just a woman, and that she didn't want to remain stuck in her gender past. This was mostly true, but not entirely. For most of her life, transgenderism had been something distant, something she didn't need to address in her daily life. She passed well on the street, and the people who knew her history, but it didn't matter anymore, they treated her as any other woman. She had moved on. Yet, she still occasionally found herself distancing from the very people she once identified with. She saw other transgender people as them, rather than us. It was hard for her to admit, but it was the truth. She had become a gender snob, someone who had distanced herself from the community she once shared, much like someone who had risen above their roots but never looked back. It reminded her of the story of a girl who grew up in the inner city, avoided the streets, worked hard, got an education and a good job, but never returned to volunteer for the neighborhood. 5 years ago, Emily let her membership expire with the gender group in San Francisco. She spoke about transgenderism, wrote about it, even did online counseling, but she had distanced herself from it emotionally. But about 8 months ago, the associate pastor at her church asked if she would start a support group for Christian transgenders. It terrified her, but she agreed. Deep down, she hoped no one would show up. Then, she expanded her online ministry to include chats, mailing lists, and a discussion board. Yet, despite all her progress, she still felt threatened that her carefully built normal life might be slipping away. As the flight attendant came by asking for dinner choices, Emily barely registered the question. "Chicken or beef?" she asked, snapping back to reality. Emily opted for chicken. The nervous man across from her had chosen beef. As Emily glanced at his plate, she was glad she had chosen differently. Life was full of choices, each one shaping the direction of our lives. What major we chose in college, who we decided to marry, the job we took, it all led us down different paths. Every choice, every decision, is a Rubicon we cross, altering the course of our destiny. But how does one define the right choice? Is it the easiest, the most practical, the safe one, the righteous one, or the profitable one? Emily knew the answer, though she feared it. The right choice was the one that aligned her will with God's, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable that might be. 3 months ago, she made a choice that would bring her to this moment. She had received an invitation to First Event in Boston, a gender conference. Her initial response was practical, she couldn't afford it. But by the end of the day, she received an offer to cover her airfare and hotel, making her excuse vanish. With mixed feelings, she accepted, excited but fearful of what this meant for her life and ministry. For a while, she found a renewed passion for her ministry, especially as she communicated with the event organizers. She felt like this conference could mark the beginning of something incredible for the gender community, but it also scared her. She was being drawn into the very ministry she had resisted the most. It was like setting out on a journey but still holding on to the safety of the dock, afraid to let go. Yet, the rope was beginning to fray. As Emily checked in at the event, she noticed a sign for the restrooms. Gender Society Club members use restrooms on 3rd floor only. The attention in the room felt different now, and she realized how long it had been since she had experienced this level of scrutiny. It had been years since she had felt this type of attention, but now, it was all around her. She thought to herself, it's just 2 days, and then I'll be home, back to normal. Normal held great significance for Emily. She referred to her transition as a flight into normalcy because all she really ever wanted was to live a simple, normal life. If asked to define normal, she would say it was living in a modest home,
teaching at a small rural college, working in the church, and never needing to mention the word transgender in a sentence. Well, 3 out of 4 wasn't bad. What definitely wasn't normal was being in a room full of TVs, TSs, TGs, CDS, and a whole collection of other acronyms. One woman, a director of a gender identity center, remarked how shocking it was for her to return from a conference like this and deal with shorter women with high voices. Emily scanned the list of workshops: a panel on successful transitions, a color seminar, makeover sessions, a seminar for crossdresser spouses, wigs, and makeup. Been there, done that, she muttered to herself more than once. After checking in and receiving her badge, Emily noticed a table in the vendor area. It wasn't staffed, but it had information for the next day's workshop and Sunday's retreat. There were papers on the table, including a list of ministry resources for TGs, commentaries on scriptures used against TGs, and an agenda for the events. Emily added some brochures about her web ministry to the table. A fashion show was scheduled for later, but feeling jet-lagged, Emily decided to skip it and relax in her hotel room. She went down to the hotel shop to grab some snacks and ended up chatting with the owner, a young Christian woman. They started talking about the conference but quickly veered into a conversation about faith. Emily appreciated the normalcy of the conversation, finding it refreshing. Back in her room, Emily received a call from MIA, the organizer of the Christian retreat. They made plans to meet the next day. Though she was 2 hours ahead, Emily couldn't seem to sleep. She pulled out her Bible and began reading. "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth." Romans 1 verse 16 KJV. The words struck her. Not ashamed, powerful words. She had never been ashamed of the gospel, but being transgender was a different matter. She pondered the lingering sense of shame. She'd thought she had dealt with it years ago, so why did she feel more comfortable talking to the girl at the candy counter than with the people at the conference? Had she subconsciously distanced herself from the community? The thought lingered. She dozed off, but when she saw the clock, it was already 2 a.m. and she had a 9 o'clock meeting to attend. She decided to get some rest. During breakfast the next morning, Emily had a light conversation with Cameron, who ran a major TG ministry online. They discovered they both lived in California, just a few hours apart, and ironically met in Boston. After chatting with Cameron, Emily spent some time staffing the table. As she observed the attendees, a young woman signing in caught her attention. Something about her looked familiar: long dark hair, slender frame, classic features. Then it clicked, it was Morgan. "Morgan!" Emily exclaimed, and they embraced warmly. Morgan and Emily had been cyber friends for nearly a year, talking regularly on the phone. Morgan was Emily's closest transgender friend. While Emily was open about her gender history, Morgan was more private. They had taken different paths, but shared a common goal: to minister to the transgender community for Christ. Emily admired Morgan's courage. While Emily had largely come out to the people who mattered in her life, Morgan worked mostly in the background, using the internet for ministry to protect her privacy. Emily respected her friend's willingness to take such a risk and felt a deep sense of mutual respect between them. It felt comforting to speak with someone she knew in the midst of such an unfamiliar place. Talking to Morgan, a friend she shared history with, felt like connecting with someone normal amidst the often overwhelming world of gender identity. Their bond had long extended beyond just the issue of gender, making it like reconnecting with a non-transgender friend in a distant, sometimes strange world. Emily glanced across the aisle. The nervous man had gone to the bathroom, and a travel feature played on the TV. She adjusted her headphones and tried to focus, but her thoughts kept returning to the convention. Sitting at the table had been an eye-opening experience. People from all walks of life, TGs, TSs, CDS, and various others, came by, asking questions. Some were playful, others more serious, but no heated arguments occurred. It was not the time or place for conflict. Many people took brochures, and Emily found herself amused by those who carefully read them, asked detailed questions, and then quickly explained they were seeking information for a friend. Emily couldn't help but wonder if they had taken a similar approach when first visiting a therapist looking for answers for someone else. Morgan stayed with Emily at the table for a good portion of the day, and they stuck together through much of the conference. It felt, Emily mused, like they were reassuring themselves that, despite being at the event, they were still somewhat detached from the community. But, as the days went on, that sense of detachment faded, replaced by an uncomfortable yet undeniable sense of belonging. It wasn't entirely unpleasant, but it certainly unsettled her. The more Emily thought about it, the harder it became to ignore the unease she felt at being in the community. As she watched the nervous man shift uncomfortably in his seat, trying to create just a little more space between himself and the window, Emily couldn't help but reflect on why she felt both comfortable and uncomfortable in this environment. There didn't seem to be a simple explanation. One reason was the lingering shame. Even after 8 years of therapy and 6 years since her transition, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of shame. She didn't want to be associated with those people, those who hadn't transitioned successfully or those who rejected societal norms by being overtly bizarre. Deep down, she feared she might be more like them than she was willing to admit. And that fear gave way to pride. She found herself, like the Pharisee in the temple, thanking God she wasn't like other men or transgendered folks. But how different was she really? Did she sometimes secretly take pleasure in moments when she had been misread, catching others off guard? Did she still have items in her closet from her early transition that felt like remnants of a past she was trying to move beyond? But none of that diminished her worth in God's eyes. Her critical eye was more often pointed inward than outward. Then there was the call. Emily had always felt called to ministry in some form. She had been involved in lay ministry since she was 14, serving as a youth director, engaging in concert ministries, and teaching. For years, she had distanced herself from ministry, believing that God couldn't use a transgendered person in that capacity. But now, after a period of restoration, the call had returned, stronger and more demanding than ever. This wasn't just any calling, it was one that asked her to return to a place she thought she had left behind. It was like a missionary's daughter returning to the mission field after swearing she would never go back. But there it was, the call. It was a word that filled her with awe, fear, and humility. It was a word that led her across the country to minister to people facing the same fears and challenges she once did. And so, there she was, sitting in a circle with 15 other transgendered people, listening to their stories. The testimony service was something Emily was familiar with. She had grown up in a Pentecostal church where people shared their experiences of faith and answered prayers. Though testimony services had faded from mainstream church services by her college years, they had persisted in smaller, more intimate settings like Sunday school and home Bible studies. The experience of being surrounded by so many different types of transgender individuals, crossdressers, transsexuals, and others was both familiar and strange to Emily. It was eye-opening to hear their spiritual and gender journeys, many of which ran parallel to her own. For many, the struggles with gender and spirituality intertwined and often led to similar turning points. Emily listened intently, her eyes brimming with tears, as the stories of others mirrored her own. It seemed that each person had their own Rubicon moment, an emotional and spiritual awakening followed by a pivotal decision. It reminded Emily of her own spiritual journey, when she had felt the absence of something in her life, a deep longing, only to discover that Christ held the answers. That revelation came with the call for surrender, giving up control and trusting that God could manage her life better than she could. It felt like salvation, a fresh start. The decision to surrender wasn't easy, but these people had done it twice, once with their spiritual lives and once with their gender. As Emily reflected on her own moments of decision, she felt connected to everyone in the room, even though they were strangers. There was a deep sense of belonging, a comforting familiarity, like the feeling of walking into her home church for the first time. Though Emily still yearned for the normalcy of her former life, it wasn't the same longing as before. It was the kind of longing one feels when they are away from home, from the familiar comfort of books and classes. She no longer felt out of place here. For the first time, she realized that those people, who she had distanced herself from for so long, were her people, a community she belonged to, whether she wanted to or not. The nervous man had returned to his seat. He quickly drank his soda, while Emily took her time, slowly sipping hers. The travel feature on the screen had switched to a segment about modern technology, which usually would have piqued Emily's interest. But today, her thoughts remained focused on the conference. Sitting at the table surrounded by so many different people, from the ordinary to the more eccentric, was a unique experience. Some were just curious, others more engaged, but there was no conflict. This was not the place for arguments. Emily observed how some people took the brochures, reading them carefully, only to quickly explain they were getting the information for a friend. She couldn't help but wonder if that was how people first visited a therapist, seeking help for someone else. Morgan joined Emily at the table for much of the day. The two of them stuck together, perhaps trying to reassure each other that, despite being at the conference, they were still separate from this community. But that assurance was slipping away, replaced by a feeling of belonging that both unsettled and intrigued Emily. It was unsettling because of the residue of shame Emily still carried. Despite all the years of therapy and transition, the shame hadn't completely vanished. She didn't want to be associated with those who hadn't transitioned successfully or who flouted social norms by being openly bizarre. She feared that deep down, she might be more like them than different. And out of that fear came pride in the way she had transitioned and the life she had built. It was like the Pharisee in the temple, thanking God that she wasn't like other men or other transgendered people. But Emily began to question how different she really was. Didn't she sometimes secretly take delight when she was misread and caused someone to question their assumptions? Didn't she still have remnants of her early transition, like a leopard skin miniskirt, tucked away in her closet? That reflection led to deeper questions. Was her critical attitude toward others truly fair? Was it rooted in her own wounds, or was it a reflection of God's love for all people, regardless of their gender identity? Then there was the call, the one that had shaped much of her life. Emily had always felt called to serve in ministry. Although she never felt led to professional, full-time ministry, she had been involved in various forms of service throughout her life. From youth leadership to teaching and even organizing concerts, she had always felt God's direction. But this call, returning to serve within the transgender community, was different. It wasn't easy. It required returning to a place she thought she had left behind. It was humbling, frightening, and at times, overwhelming. Yet, there it was, a call that demanded she face her past, her identity, and her mission to serve others who had faced similar struggles. Emily found herself sitting with a group of 15 transgendered people, listening to their stories that, in many ways, mirrored her own. She was familiar with this type of sharing, having grown up in a Pentecostal church where people shared their testimonies of faith and God's work in their lives. But this time, the stories were different. They were about gender, identity, and the struggles of living as a transgendered person in a world that didn't always understand. It was a powerful and moving experience. As Emily continued to reflect on the experience, she remembered a passage from The Lord of the Rings and thought about the internal conflict she felt, standing at the threshold of this new journey. She felt like Bilbo Baggins, reluctant to leave the comfort of her life and step into the unknown. But just as Bilbo was called to adventure, Emily felt called to embrace this new path, to trust God and step forward in faith. Emily's time at the conference was an awakening, a recognition of her place within the transgender community and a reaffirmation of her mission. She couldn't simply stand on the outside anymore. She had to fully engage with this community, minister within it, and continue the work God had called her to do. On Sunday morning, Emily and Morgan returned to the Burger King for breakfast. This time, they grabbed their food from the drive-thru and headed back to the hotel. The unspoken reality between them was that, later that day, they would each return to their respective towns and lives. Though comforting in some ways, the inevitable separation was bittersweet. They would still have the internet and phone calls, but neither could deny the difficulty of parting. There were no hugs or hand-holding through a screen. Both knew that God had placed them where they were, and that they would meet again in His time, whether here, there, or in the air. But for now, the thought of that final hug lingered unspoken. By noon, they made their way downstairs for the retreat, an event that would include a church service and communion. Emily had no idea how life-changing this service would turn out to be. The liturgical format was based on Catholic practices, a far cry from Emily's evangelical, Pentecostal roots. Growing up, she hadn't had much exposure to liturgy, but as a Gideon, she'd attended enough services to appreciate the orderliness of the format. It was a welcome change from her Pentecostal background, where things were rarely predictable. Who could have imagined that conservative Pentecostals would come to accept a transgender person as part of their family? The homily came from 1 Corinthians 12, a passage about the body of Christ and how every part of the body, no matter how small, is essential to the whole. It resonated deeply with the group, many of whom had felt rejected by the church, marginalized as if they had no place in the body of Christ. A table was set at the front of the room, and the group gathered around it in a semicircle. On the table, there was a loaf of bread and a goblet of wine, symbols of Christ's sacrifice. Emily's childhood memories stirred as the familiar words echoed in the room. "This is my body, broken for you. This is the new covenant in my blood. Take, eat. Take, drink. Do this in remembrance of me." They took the bread and the wine. They remembered. And they wept. Standing together before God, their identities as transgender children of God felt like a quiet defiance of the world's rejection. They were partaking in His righteousness, fully accepted in His love. As they sang Amazing Grace, the verses rang with deep meaning. "Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Twas grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me on." Emily felt the weight of grace like never before, overwhelmed by its depth and significance. As the flight attendant began to collect the headsets, Emily knew the plane would soon be landing in Los Angeles. She would have to rush from the large plane to the smaller one to get back to Fresno and her normal life. The nervous man, now sitting upright, trembled again as the plane dipped. He covered his face with his hands. Emily looked out the window, squinting through the night sky at the lights of the city below her. She realized that her normal life was about to change. She could no longer keep her real ministry separate from her transgendered ministry. God's call couldn't be compartmentalized. The shoreline that had once seemed like a secure boundary had been washed away when she accepted the invitation to First Event. She was adrift, her course uncertain, but trusting God to guide her through the winds and waves of this new path. As she made her way to her connecting flight, questions swirled in her mind. Would she have to leave behind the life she had built? How much would God require of her? Would she have to give up her normal life? Just as she was about to board the small plane to Fresno, she saw a ticket taker at the counter putting on a jacket and picking up her purse. A familiar voice whispered in her spirit, "Remember, even the airport personnel get to go home at the end of the day." Emily boarded the plane, feeling a sense of peace. "Yes, Lord, I understand," she whispered, settling into her seat for the short flight home.